Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We're glad that you can join us for a very exciting panel discussion with some on the eve of the industry leading experts in forensic science and criminal justice. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Walter Parson, who will be our moderator for this morning panel discussion and who will be introducing the panel experts. Before we go along, remember that for the full listing of details of the panelists, please click on the tab that you have on the top of your screen. And for sure, if you have any questions during the presentation, we encourage you to submit them in the Q&A box, and we will try our best to take as many questions as possible during the session. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Walter Parson and the panelists. Walter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chevy. Hello, everybody. Good morning from Innsbruck, Austria. I'm looking forward to this panel discussion that we are going to have together. We are going to discuss how to maximize the impact of forensic DNA, and we have 45 minutes for that. And you're invited to actively participate in this. So please ask questions, use the tool. We try to accommodate your questions. If it's impossible, we can tackle them later. We have a wonderful panel that I would like to briefly introduce to you before we start the discussion. We have a victim advocate, Vanessa Lynch. She's coming in from South Africa. Those of you who were on the call earlier saw her presentation. She's a founder of the DNA Project and the DNA Project Africa, which are both non-profit organizations and dedicated to the use of advocacy outreach and forensic expertise to aid the development of databasing and forensic DNA skills in the countries throughout Africa. We have investigators, Klaas Vervloed and Stephanie van Zeulen. Klaas is with the Dutch police for more than 40 years. He gave a presentation today earlier as well. He has vast experience in forensic investigations and support investigations in serious and major national and international crime. Klaas has actually pioneered the efforts in implementing rapid DNA technology already in 2013. Stephanie's background is research in cancer. She just joined the National Police Laboratory in 2019. Her current role is focused on the implementation of the Applied Biosystems Rapid Hit ID. Our forensic expert is Sylvain Hubac. He's calling in from France. Sylvain has a PhD in molecular biology and in genetics. He joined the National Gendarmerie in 2004, and he is basically performing research, development, and validation of methods for forensic laboratory analysis. Sylvain was directly involved in the identification of the victims of the Germanwings air crash in 2015 and the 2016 terrorist attack in Nice, which I think is all still in our memories. And then we have our legal expert, Chris Asplin. He's calling in from the US. He's a very early bird. It's 5 a.m. in the US at this time. Chris, thanks for doing this. Chris is the executive director of the National Criminal Justice Association. He serves as a principal liaison between the state and local units in the government and various agencies of the US government. He has assisted the development of curricula and materials for convenings of more than 35 international governments, both in Bratislava, Slovakia, and the International Peace Palace in The Hague, the Netherlands. So before we draw the attention to our discussion, I would like to remind you again, please use this format and ask questions. We decided to dedicate this discussion into 3 major topics, trying to shed light on the maximization of impact of forensic DNA. And I would like to start with the topic that is central to all forensic analysis, and that is the evidence. That's the evidence that we find at the crime scene and that we try to analyze. So how can we make this analysis more effective? And for that, I would like to start with our colleagues in the Netherlands. Please tell us, what is the evidence material that you are typically confronted with, and what are the challenges that you are facing with those materials?
Okay. Most important evidence or samples we take is blood and saliva, so for DNA, but also fingerprint samples in every sample at the crime scene. But for the rapid DNA, and that's our challenge, is to start with rapid DNA. I told you before, there is a big problem to start with rapid DNA in the Netherlands. We have to take many steps to be operational. And I think maybe in 1 month we can start really, because the law is changing and the other problems are solved, and we can start with operational cases only for saliva and blood. But we did a test before with the rapid hit, and we know that a pulled hair also gives you a good result. But until now, it's validated for blood and saliva, cigarette butts and everything.
And only for terrorist cases for right now. So we cannot use the machine for other cases other than terrorism right now.
That's actually a good point. Sorry. What you just said, Klaas and Stephanie, makes good sense, and probably the audience is wondering if you can share more details how you're going to implement the rapid DNA technology in terms of where do you locate it. We all know the Netherlands is a small country, so distances from crime scenes to laboratories may not be that large as they would be in other countries. But apparently you're already pretty advanced with this technology. So can you please give us more insight on this?
Okay. In my presentation, maybe you saw it, you can see that it takes days or sometimes weeks to have a DNA analyzed and to be ready and look at the database. And we look to speed up this process. So we built the rapid hit in a van, and the idea was to go to a crime scene. So to shorten this time of investigation and to make the decision by the forensic investigator themselves, okay, this is really a sample I can use. This is really a sample of a perpetrator. I can put it in my rapid hit and have the results back in a few hours. So that was very important to shorten this time. When we bring it to a laboratory, that's normally our National Forensic Institute, it's our preferred lab. It will do the investigation also quickly, 4 till 6 hours. But we think when you are on the crime scene, and as a police officer, I can tell you, we know sometimes we are a little bit quicker at the crime scene already, and we have to choose after your investigation directly the sample you can use. Not like normal. Normally, I did a lot of cases. Normal, it takes maybe the whole day when you have a murder case to investigate it. And
all right, so it's the best. Sorry, go ahead.
As Stephanie told you, for us, it was very important in terrorist cases and also serious and organized crime cases to be sure we have the right guy. So not do all the things with other police officers, maybe surveillance or everything else, and having the wrong suspect. So that's important to identify him very soon.
Okay, so I understand it's the response time that is critical, and I think that is the case and has been observed in a couple of other scenarios. What comes to my mind is the quick response time that they were trying to get with the disasters in France. Sylvain, you were elemental in trying to identify victims, and for the German wing crash and the terrorists in the Nice attack. Can you share your opinion in terms of response time and the use of the rapid DNA technology for that?
Yeah, for in my institute we have a different approach for rapid DNA technology because the definition of rapid DNA is very compact instrument where you can process all the steps all in one instrument. But for DVI context, and for example, during the terrorist attack in Nice or during the air crash Germanwings, there is too many samples to analyze simultaneously, and that's why rapid DNA technology for this moment, the throughput is not enough to give the good response for the investigation. So that's why we have a different approach for the rapid DNA and for the mobile lab technology. So we developed, it's like a van, okay, but we integrate in this van all the regular materials that you use in your lab. So basically, we use regular thermocycle, regular DNA extraction method, and 3500 Excel also. And by this way, we can process 96 samples simultaneously. So by this way, we can obtain DNA results of many fragments of unknown bodies, and it's very efficient in this case.
Thank you, Sylvain. We got a question in here, which I think fits very nice the topic. It's about the ability of detecting single versus mixed profiles with the rapid DNA technology. So the question actually is, how can you tell if the blood stain taken from the crime scene is single source, or once a mixture is seen, how would you continue? And that is open to the entire panelists, so feel free to chime in.
So the question is, if you have what do you do if you have single source of mixture?
Right. I mean, so the question is, if you have a mixed sample, and you can tell upfront, right, because you don't know if it's a mixture or not, you see it when you analyze it. So what is the reaction once you see the mixture? Are you analyzing the mixture with the rapid hit, or are you? What are the further steps if you see a mixture?
We analyze the data with GeneMapper, and we can use also other software like Stereo Mix. So in fact, when you have to deal with rapid technology, we use regular workflow.
All right. So I understand you use the profile that comes from the rapid DNA instrument, and you use software to be able to interpret the mixture as it would come from a regular CE instrument.
Yeah, correct.
Vanessa, Klaus, would you like to answer this, or Stephanie?
Yes, so if we would suspect that a sample is a mixture, we wouldn't run it on the rapid hits system, but we would send it to the National Forensic Institute. A way of knowing or deciding whether it might be a mixture or not is to look at the scenario, what's going on, what happened, how many people were involved, how likely is it that there is a mixture of this sample. But that will be analyzed before we get the sample. So there's a team of people that actually decide this is probably a mixture or this is probably not a mixture. If it's a single source, they will give it to us. If it's not, then they will send it to the National Forensic Institute.
I have one more question here, which I would like to bring up to the panel. What different sample sources can be analyzed by RAPID? And I repeat that Klaus was saying that in the Netherlands, you intend to use it for blood samples and saliva, right? Would you like to add other information to that?
Yes, we are testing the rapid hit in my lab, actually, and so we deal with different kind of samples, of course, blood samples, saliva, cigarette butts, but also we test some fragment of bones, So it works very good with fresh bones. And for that, we developed a specific method to collect bones and directly the fragment of bones inside the cartridge. And we obtained a very good result with that.
Great, thank you very much. And then another question that fits very well, so let's take it and maybe we can provide a very quick answer. What is the sensitivity of rapid DNA testing? So how few DNA would provide a useful result?
The result obtained from deleted blood is you can obtain a full DNA profile from blood diluted 1 to 50, 1 to 100. But you can consider 20 microliter of blood on swab, and you dilute 1 to 15, 1 to 100, and you can obtain a full DNA profile.
All right, thank you. Claire, Stephanie, did you do any particular sensitivity experiments on the rapid hit? That seems to be a general question from the audience.
So I haven't been working on the rapid hit 200 system for the sensitivity, but I'm working on it for the rapid hit ID, and I'm actually planning on testing the sensitivity next week, so I don't have any data on that yet. So.
Fantastic. So all those who are interested, please contact Stephanie in 1 week or give her another week, then she will have the answers for that. All right. If we take a closer look at the interplay of the case, for example, that we are trying to improve in terms of the analytics and the actual identification process, what are the challenges there? And I would like to bring our discussion more into the point how are we using the DNA information in order to find the criminals, and that is particularly addressing the databasing system. Vanessa, you have outlined the situation in Africa quite well. Would you like to speak to this situation for a third world country and tell the challenges that you see there?
Thank you, Walter. Yes, I think there's a misconception that once you pass a DNA law or DNA laws that you can launch into identifying and convicting criminals, and it requires a lot more commitment, and this is where the challenges really come into play. The first is funding. A lot of governments don't understand that the commitment to this technology requires a huge amount of funding for consumables, for maintenance, and for sampling. And this is something we've hit in South Africa, is that they've withdrawn a lot of this funding with the result that the initial growth of the database has now been greatly reduced because the funding has been withdrawn. So I think that is something that if developing countries are looking at passing DNA laws or in the process of it, is really to ensure that the government or the administration understands the financial commitment, because you maybe don't invest too much in the capital and maybe have a smaller investment which makes sure that the consumables are funded going forward. Otherwise, you just land up with big forensic laboratories that aren't actually working, which is currently where we're facing a situation like that. And the second challenge, which you mentioned, is actually once you have your database in place and you actually are analyzing and loading profiles onto the database, how does that translate into convictions? How does it translate into identifying offenders? And this is the follow-up, what we call the follow-up of investigative leads that are issued from the DNA laboratory. And oftentimes, the people at the ground level who are the task force, the police force, don't have a very good understanding of what a DNA profile means in terms of the value. So these wonderful forms of evidence, these wonderful hits and investigative leads are left lying on a desk because they probably are not necessarily given to the task force in a language that they understand. So we need to really look at how are we translating this information to ground level in order for them to understand the real value of what it is that a DNA profile there's been a hit on the database. We've just recently instituted task teams. So we've got specialized task teams in South Africa now, and all they do is they receive the hits from the database manager, and they work in teams to make sure that those are followed up, especially when you have more than one hit per person. So those are the greatest two challenges, and there are lots of others that possibly other developing countries might consider when ensuring that they are, making sure that it translates into convictions or crime resolution.
Thank you very much. What you have been referring to is probably true for many countries, even if we want to call them first world countries. I'm not sure if this is a good term to use, but the follow-up of the actual DNA match to the executive forces that actually then try to solve the crime seems to me a problem that is a general problem all over the world. So I understand with the DNA project, you are trying to provide information that can be applied to different countries. It's not only for Africa.
Yes, we've got, the thing is that we've specifically realized now with this pandemic, the world is actually a small place, and it's very easy to communicate with each other. And one of the things that is really striking is that when you have information available to yourself, it's a great benefit to share it with other countries, specifically where you have gone through problems and where you can share your challenges and work together. So in South Africa, it's been an enormous struggle because we have, first of all, technology in a developing country. But we didn't reinvent the wheel. We really did, from the DNA project side, link in with a lot of other countries and leaders in this field in order to help us produce the results that we have had. And we'll continue to have challenges. So by the same token, South Africa and the DNA project wants to reach out into Africa and other developing countries to say, don't reinvent the wheel. Look at what we've done. Talk to us about privacy challenges, challenges we've just spoken about now, legislative recommendations. And this is something we really want to assist other countries. We don't have to start from scratch. Let's utilize the information that we have collectively and try and find solutions that fit into different countries looking for solutions.
Thank you, Vanessa. Chris, your expertise goes beyond the situation of databasing in the US, as you have been involved in different scenarios worldwide. Would you like to speak to this in addition to what Vanessa said?
Sure. Thank you, Walter. There are a lot of different collateral consequences that come along with databasing, as Vanessa mentioned, that really need to be anticipated when passing legislation, including the funding, again, as Vanessa said. One thing I'll add to that, for example, is you will necessarily, when passing legislation, and just by the nature of increasing your database and the size of the database, there will be add-on applications that police, the public, and other folks will want. For example, what we saw in the United States was the emergence of cold case units all over the country. Once we had a database and we realized that there was a great value to going back and looking at old cases, taking biological samples, testing them and putting them in the database, well, that created essentially a whole new market, a whole new community of folks that wanted to use the database. Well, one of the collateral consequences in that is, how do you deal with victims? How do you deal with victims who may have put this case behind them 10 years ago, but now the police are essentially bringing it back to life and solving it? There are a lot of resources that necessarily have to go into that aspect of solving a cold case. You have another collateral consequence, for example, we saw in the United States, was defense attorneys wanting to leverage the database because they would say that their client was innocent, but if they were able to test the database, that they could then prove that. So anticipating those collateral consequences when considering databasing legislation is really super important to maximize its effectiveness.
Thank you, Chris. I have a question here which probably fits to what we just discussed. And this question relates to the approach of loading a crime scene profile onto the database in order to do the database search. It is probably quite a challenging question, particularly if we consider technology, and not only technology, but also legal aspects. But the background of the question apparently seems to be the attempt to minimize errors and problems that are associated with bringing the samples from the crime scene to the laboratory, performing the analysis in the laboratory, and then finally uploading the profile, which goes through many hands of the individuals. Is anybody at the panel willing to speak to that question about what would be the way forward in the different aspects of trying to load crime scene profiles already from the crime scene?
So with our van, we actually are at the crime scene. So we get our sample, we run the rapid hit machine, and then we have a secure network that allows us to directly send our sample into the database. So we have a really quick
line.
Yeah, it's a quick line for us to do that.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. How is the situation with that in the US, Chris? Do you know?
We have, over, I guess, the last 10 or 15 years, we have put a tremendous amount of effort into training and education for our law enforcement in terms of collection, transportation, et cetera. So while it's always an issue that you have to be, top of mind of, if you will, and that has to be kind of a priority, I don't think we find terribly often that is a difficulty or a problem. That being said, the opportunity and the availability of doing DNA testing closer to the crime scene, and more importantly, closer in time to the crime, right? That really maximizes the potential of the technology. The closer you get to both the crime scene and to the time of the event of the crime, the more you're maximizing the potential of the technology.
All right, thank you very much. We have a question here that is a very interesting question. It comes from the city of Karachi in Pakistan. They have the problem that they don't have a database yet. So can the panel speak to potential solutions for the situation if there is a crime, or if there is the requirement of forensic DNA typing, and then in the lack of the database to solve issues? I mean, that goes back to situations where we didn't have DNA databases either. What could be a recommendation to a country that does not have a functioning DNA database yet in order to be able to solve crimes, or to provide investigative leads on crimes that are in this situation? Vanessa, maybe you can speak to this.
Hi, Walter. Sorry. I have to say, I think it was a bit of a dodgy Wi-Fi moment there in terms of your actual question. So do you want me to would you just repeat that last part?
Sorry, yeah. We have a case from a country that doesn't have a DNA database yet, and a crime happened in the city of Karachi in Pakistan. They wonder what steps they can take to try to make use of DNA profiles prior to being able to search it in a DNA database. is there an idea that you can speak to?
Yes. Interestingly enough, we have a separate unit for disaster victim identification and missing persons. And even though now those profiles are loaded onto the database, they do have their own sort of mini database where they collate those profiles. And in fact, they use rapid DNA technology in that particular department, which is the only department that uses it. So I think that the collection of DNA profiles for a specific purpose will always be allowed to some extent or the other. And when we got our DNA laws and we translated those profiles, we then were able to formally put those profiles into the database within the confines of the law. So if there were any profiles that didn't fall within the provisions of the law, for instance, if it was over a certain amount of time or a particular category of person, they weren't allowed to be on the database. But there was value, nevertheless, in keeping those profiles for all that time until such time laws were in place, in which case they were then translated into a database. But I think there's always value in retaining profiles as far as possible. And I think that in this particular case, I would imagine that they would possibly be able to do that under a separate system of disaster victim identification and missing persons, where there's always a possibility of later identification. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add to that or if they've had a similar situation.
Walter, if I could add to that, if we go back to the first case where DNA was ever used in a forensic context, right? That was also the first time that we used intelligence screens. And intelligence screens, and they're still widely used, they are essentially the creation of mini databases, absent the legislation necessary to create that larger database. But what it does allow police and laboratories to do is to focus on a particular area or a particular demographic and leverage DNA technology in what we would simply call a smaller database that doesn't have to be legislatively created. And you don't even need the software for that, right? I mean, that could be a spreadsheet. It's a little more labor intensive, but the leveraging of intelligence screens voluntarily, asking for volunteers, et cetera, is a technique that has been used literally since day one of forensic DNA testing, and continues to be used today. That being said, we need to be careful with it, and that the lack of legislation can lead to violation of people's rights. That's why legislation is important. So I think if police are going to use intelligence screens, that they need to do it with a real eye towards human rights and civil rights. But it's a very valid tool, still used all over the world.
Thanks, Chris. That's great, and that's perfectly preparing the floor for a question that I would like to pick here. It comes from Israel, and the question is: who is responsible for the analysis of the profile? The user in the field, or an expert back in the database, laboratory/database? So that is a legal question. Probably we have different answers depending on the country. But I would like to invite the panel to try to answer this. Chris, you want to give it a start?
Well, sure. I'll tell you the way that rapid DNA in particular is shaping up in the United States is that while law enforcement is allowed to use it, and I say allowed specifically because we had to change some of our laws that allowed for police to use rapid DNA outside the context of the laboratory. Prior to that, prior to federal legislation changing, that what we call a booking station or police station model wasn't possible. But now it is. But that profile, while it may be tested and it may be analyzed in a rapid hit in a police station or in a van somewhere, that ultimately still goes, that result still goes to the laboratory, still goes to the CODIS lab, and it is still evaluated at that point in time. So the answer to your question is both. In the United States, it necessarily needs to be both the police officer responsible on the scene or a crime scene analyst, and then the lab.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, please.
In France, it's very different because there is only the DNA expert that is able to upload a DNA profile in a database and able to analyze. The DNA expert must be certified by the court, and even if there is a hit, for example, on the database, the hit must be confirmed by the DNA expert. So the guys on the field are not able to interpret the results. They are just able to collect the evidences, but not interpret the result.
Thank you very much. I was assuming that there are different answers to that question. And apparently our discussions triggered a new question, which I would like to put up here. It asks, we should be more clear about what a database is. So in case those countries that they don't have a database, do we, and I'm reading the question here, do we have to create the DNA database of all the citizens or just from the crime guys? And I like the expression crime guys very much. So what can we answer in terms of what kind of samples would populate an intelligence database?
It's only relevant traces, of course. For example, in France, we have to deal with many touch DNA samples, and in this case, it's very important to be aware that if you collect everywhere in each support, you can obtain the DNA, of course. But what kind of DNA you obtain? Do you obtain the DNA of the perpetrators or the DNA of the victim? And most of the time, if you collect such DNA, for example, for burglaries cases, you collect the DNA of the victim. And if you are not able to discriminate this DNA profile before to load this profile inside the database, so you are in your database with many DNA profile of victims and not suspects.
I would say that one thing to be careful of is to not develop your database the way the United States did it initially. We did it wrong. We made the mistake of, when we first started databasing, we only included the most serious crimes, and for our offender index, only the most serious criminals. But that's really not the way to do it, because the most serious criminals, when they get convicted, they go to jail for a long time. They're not out. You're not solving their crimes. The important thing to do is to include in your database individuals who are convicted or accused of high volume crimes like burglary. Burglars commit a lot of burglaries. Car thefts. Car thieves commit a lot of car thefts. Drug dealers, they do that a lot. And making sure that you are leveraging DNA on those high volume crimes. And I'm not saying don't include murderers and rapists, you should. But if you're going to maximize the power of your DNA database, you want to make sure you include those individuals who commit their crimes a lot, high volume, high impact crimes, which we did not do in the United States. And it took us a long time to change the law again and again and again in every state before we got to the point where we were really maximizing the potential.
If I can add to that, we in South Africa went a little bit further than that. We created a schedule of offences which ranged from most serious violent crimes down to burglary and theft, but we also left out a number of crimes. So we called it a Schedule 8 crimes. The problem with that was actually the administrative burden of sifting through what type of crime it was. So even though they left off things like drunken driving, it was still a process of having to sort through it, both from convicted offenders and arrestees. So whilst their reason was initially to not overburden the forensic science laboratories with too many samples of minor crimes, what they landed up doing was actually making it burdensome to continuously have to sift through whether this should be included or expunged or sampled. So I think that Chris just to add to yours, both from, an administrative as well as a criminal career path, it is much better to have as many all types of crimes and not discriminate between them for obvious reasons.
Yes, thank you very much. Quite a complex scenario that we're looking at. In the interest of time, I would like to move on. There are a couple of questions which I cannot address, so please apologize, the audience. You will have the possibility to get those questions answered after our communication. I would like to carry on to alternative methods that we use to narrow down the pool of our suspects. I mean, databasing is an intelligence tool primarily that tries to find suspects. If we can't find a hit in the database, then there are different options to reduce the pool of the potential suspects. And we all are aware of these keywords that we have here. One is investigative genetic genealogy, which is very much centered in the US. Ancestry testing and phenotyping, which I understand is more performed in the European or Eurasian world, I would like to say. Can I ask the panel to speak to this? And maybe we start with the genetic genealogy. Chris, if you want to sketch the situation real quick, what is going on there in the US?
Yeah, sure. So in the US, like as in most, if not all of the DNA applications, in the United States, it's very state specific. Our system is such that the individual states, they create their own legislation that decides what kind of DNA can be used and how big the database is, consistent with overall federal regulations, but the states decide it. So there are actually some states in the United States that do not allow, for example, what we refer to as familial testing or close match testing. There are some states that have made the political decision that if there is a family member in a database, that it is not fair or consistent with privacy rights, that someone else should be allowed to be identified in the database, that they become suspects, if you will. And that's not really true, but that's the political dynamic under which the decisions are made. So again, from a genealogy standpoint, goes back to, it's really important to create good legislation, to be thoughtful about the legislation, and in doing so, bring the public into that, have the public understand what's going on. The thing that maximizes and affects the power of DNA the most is what the law allows you to do with it. Doesn't matter how good your rapid technology is. It doesn't matter how good your crime scene collection is if the law doesn't allow you to use it. So paying attention to that, and we're going through this on a state-by-state basis with genealogy testing, for example, is all part of that. And we need to do more of it in the United States. There are probably a handful of states that are doing it, not nearly as many as should.
Thanks, and your explanation just triggered a question which I think matches perfectly in here. Should we invest more in kinship analysis / forensic genealogy to maximize the rate of solved crimes? I mean, we hear the success story in the media. We hear those investigative leads that, brought us the perpetrator, and sometimes it's cold cases 25 years ago, so that's great news. Can you say something about the efficiency of this method? How many of those investigations go cold, and what is the situation in that respect?
Yeah, I don't know how many of those cases go cold. I don't know how many kinship cases are successful versus how many are not. I do know that oftentimes they're used in the most serious of cases, right? And so when we get a hit and it's a very big matter in the United States, as it should be, right? And so I think the analysis is more a matter of the value of the particular hits as contrasted with the volume of hits that we get. But again, it's a very political matter. And if you've turned on the television in the last 3 weeks, you've seen that in the United States, we're having some difficulty rethinking our relationship with law enforcement and what that means. And this will be part of it. It's not right now, but this discussion will be part of what goes on as again, United States begins to rethink that relationship with law enforcement.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let's turn this back to Europe. Europe has some very few successful cases or implementations of this, but as a matter of fact, the database sizes are just too small. But I think we in Europe, we can speak for successes in using alternative technology like DNA phenotyping and ancestry testing. Klaas, Stephanie, would you like to speak to this, particularly with the experience you made in the Netherlands? I think you were pioneering this kind of work.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I have no experience with the databases. I know we are sending out data to the National Forensic Institute, and I know they use all the possibilities for familiar searching, kinship, ancestry, everything. So that's possible. And I know some cases they work with, but I have no experience myself with analyzing data and everything else.
We did have a few big cold cases that were solved using a DNA analysis where a familiar hit was generated. Sorry, and by doing more research, they found the actual criminal in those cases. So we did have some really good successes with those type of investigations.
Right, and if I remember correctly, it's finding the perpetrator on one side, but taking out the extreme chaotic situation when, for example, minorities are considered to be hosting the suspect, and all the social situation that is going on when we think about refugees that may fall under suspicion in terms of those crimes. And I think some lessons were learned there in the Netherlands that work very well for the rest of the world in terms of how to strategically approach these investigations. And I understand from their experience that the ancestry testing was very informative, as well as the phenotype analysis. In France, Sylvain, how is the situation there? I'm sure you're performing research in this direction. What is the legal situation in France? And probably you can talk about the difficulties in trying to use ancestry or phenotypic information.
In France, so it's very new. So phenotyping investigation are very limited, and basically we use this type of technology when all the regular techniques are failed. And there is a very important part of individual freedom in France, and that's why it's for the moment very difficult to implement more this kind of technology. But we use it. We use it when all the regular technique gave a negative result or not an efficient result.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. I just realized how time flies. I would like to come back and open the view and the picture that we are discussing here and talk more about the public and the political challenges that we face related to casework and DNA databasing. And I would like to invite you, Vanessa, to speak to this, particularly, the keyword the evolution of the administration, be it a database result from a conventional DNA analysis, be it a new technology that creates this result. You have been addressing this earlier a bit, but would you like to expand on this? What are the challenges that we are going to face once we have set up these systems in order to be able to get them going?
Thanks, Walter. Yes, I think the important thing is to evolve not only your legislation, but your legislation must evolve with the technology. And my advice would be certainly in passing legislation, don't go for perfect legislation. I think whatever legislation you are able to get with your administration, and we all have different privacy laws and we all have different local challenges. But certainly once you have DNA laws in place, make sure that at least every 3 to 5 years that you have a system in place whereby you can make recommendations back to the policyholders in terms of changes that need to be made. This is something that we've just done 5 years after our legislation. We've sent a DNA report to our parliament and we've made recommendations for changes to the legislation, some of which haven't worked that need to be altered, and other new recommendations which are aligned with the technology we talk about genealogy, that didn't exist at the time our legislation was passed. So it's very important to have a process or a system in place. In our case, it was an oversight body that allows the legislation not to remain stagnant, that there's a facility that enables the legislation to evolve together with this technology, which is moving at such a fast rate.
Okay, I mean, for the majority of us that are not familiar with the involvement of the legal situation, I think this is an important information, and it comes to my mind that what we need to do is we need to network not only between the scientists that we are probably used to when it comes to our methods and technologies, but expand this networking. And I don't want to use the term lobbying, but it's kind of sharing information and speaking to another field. So the experience that you have here seems to be quite good.
Definitely. And again, it's about understanding that not all of our circumstances are going to be the same, but certainly there is always going to be overlap. And learning from others, we can decide which information is relevant and which we can take forward. And that applies to all of us. But we have the ability now to network and solve crime together. And I think it's something that we really need to launch into going forward. It's something we haven't done in the past, and we need to do more of it now going forward.
Thank you very much. That triggers a question which has some legal background and probably also results in what we just said before. Who can order DNA tests? Full stop. Who can order DNA tests? I would be interested if the panel can give short answers to that question in the respective countries. Chris, do you want to give that one a start?
Sure. In the United States, the legislation determines who is included in the database. So, and again, that's on a state basis. So the state law determines what offenders get tested for, have their DNA put into the database, whether it's convicted offenders, what crimes, or arrestees. And then the police decide what they are going to collect and put into the database and test themselves. There are guidelines from the FBI, et cetera, but for the most part, it is guided by legislation in terms of the offenders, and that's really critical.
Thank you very much.
To be short, it's the same in France.
Say it again, please, Sylvain.
Yeah, to be short, it's the same in France. So,
okay, thank you.
Walter, this is Chevy. This is really super interesting, but I have to unfortunately say that we have to finish the session. Otherwise, we'll not give the delegates the option to the next session with Tim and the hit of the year. So, well, thank you very much to you and the panelists. I mean, maybe you can say a couple of words, Walter, to finish if you want. But this has been really amazing. I think that the interconnection between all of you has been great, the flow of the presentation and all the many questions we've got. So just a friendly reminder that we will resume and capture all these questions, collate them all, send them to the panelists, get the answers, and we will post them in the on-demand version of this that is going to be actually is available after this session, but we'll update it with all these questions. Just a big thank you, Walter, Chris, Vanessa, Klaas, Stephanie, Sylvain. This has been an amazing job today.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank the entire panel and also the audience for putting the many questions. This is exciting. 45 minutes passed like this.
Yeah.
So, thanks for hosting this, and I hope to see you all in a real world soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Ciao.